On a sun-drenched Saturday morning, George Hayward brushed peach glaze over a rack of ribs when a lavender envelope fluttered onto his doormat like a scented warning. He glanced at it from across the porch, half expecting it to turn into dust under the Georgia sun. Instead, it just sat there, pristine and perfumed, tucked neatly between a flyer for discounted chimney sweeping and a church newsletter. George wiped his hands on a faded dish towel and stepped down in his slippers, the boards creaking beneath his weight. He picked up the envelope and gave it a cautious sniff. Lavender. Of course. Back inside, the screen door sighed shut behind him. George set the envelope on the counter, poured himself a glass of sweet tea, and took a long sip before sliding open the knife drawer. He reached past the steak knives, past the scissors with the crooked blade, and pulled out a letter opener shaped like a feather. One of the few things Marion had insisted they keep, despite its absurdity. The seal on the envelope cracked with a faint snap. Inside was a thick cardstock pamphlet with a watercolor lotus on the cover and the title, Aesthetic Wellness Directive, Volume 1. George blinked once, then twice. He walked over to the living room, where a photo of last year's barbecue still sat on the mantel. In the picture, Mayor Foster was laughing mid-bite, her sleeve stained with sauce. George's late wife had taken the photo, she always said laughter looked better messy. He turned it slightly toward the window, like a silent nod to tradition, then dropped into his favorite chair and began reading. The directive was printed in a whimsical serif font, each paragraph gently spiraling into the next like a motivational quote. It listed several new community standards: no open flames between 9 a.m. and 7 p.m., music no louder than a conversational hum, and, George blinked again, spontaneous gatherings must align with neighborhood harmony cycles. Whatever that meant. He folded the paper carefully and set it next to the Fairgrove Gazette. On the porch, the scent of peach and mesquite drifted back into the air. The ribs would need another 10 minutes. By midday, the neighborhood had begun its usual weekend chorus: porch swing creaks, distant lawnmowers, and the occasional shout from Buddy's Bakery 2 blocks over. George shuffled down the steps and waved at Lynette, who was hanging wind chimes shaped like moons and stars. She waved back, a look of wary amusement in her eyes. "Did you get the lavender letter too?" she called. George raised his tea glass. "I did. Smells like rules and regret." A few hours later, he spotted Dolores making her usual walk with her knitting basket looped over one elbow. She paused at the community board, read the new posting with pursed lips, and then walked off muttering. That night, George heard the faint click of knitting needles from her porch, rapid and emphatic. On Sunday morning, he opened the Fairgrove Gazette while tossing a handful of birdseed across the lawn. Sparrows hopped and chirped at his feet as he read an editorial about the town's new HOA leadership. He wasn't surprised to see Karen Caldwell's name plastered in bold. Newly elected, determined to restore balance, and apparently enthusiastic about essential oils. George switched his smoker for an electric one, a newer model he'd bought on clearance, still shiny and suspiciously quiet. He placed the ribs inside and adjusted the timer, nodding to himself. Compliance had its uses. By mid-afternoon, he was setting up folding chairs along the back fence when Buddy came by holding a tray of lemon bars. "Got a new letter this morning," Buddy said. "She's banning citronella candles next. Says they interfere with natural evening rhythms." George just grunted. Buddy nudged him with the tray. "That's the face of a man who misses propane." "It's the face of a man who reads the fine print," George replied. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves of the sycamore that shaded George's backyard. He reached down and straightened the legs of the garden flamingo, a plastic sentinel Marion had bought on a dare. He dusted its beak and set it straight. It was late afternoon when Karen Caldwell herself arrived. She appeared without warning, stepping onto the porch like a stage actor at curtain call. Her outfit was a crisp linen suit in cream, paired with flats that squeaked slightly as she moved. She carried a clipboard in one hand, a pen tucked neatly behind one ear. "Mr. Hayward," she said with a tight smile. George looked up from where he was stacking corn husks into a compost bin. "Let's ensure harmony begins with the brisket." He didn't reply right away. Instead, He opened the smoker, let the scent of caramelizing glaze roll out, and gently turned the rack with a pair of tongs. Karen stood still, pen hovering near the clipboard. "I hope you've reviewed the directive," she continued. "We're asking all residents to consider their role in the sensory footprint of the neighborhood." George closed the smoker lid and nodded once. "Read it cover to cover." Karen's smile froze for half a beat. "Excellent. That's all we ask." She turned to leave, the clipboard clutched like a shield. As she stepped off the porch, she passed the flamingo. She paused, cocked her head, and stared at it for several seconds. Then she flipped to a fresh page and began jotting something with small, efficient strokes. As Karen leaves, she eyes George's garden flamingo, and jots something in her clipboard. The scent of slow-cooked ribs drifted through the cul-de-sac, and so did Karen's second complaint. George had been up since dawn, basting and flipping, checking temperatures like a surgeon in an apron. The electric smoker, humming dutifully, had turned out a golden-barked masterpiece. Folding tables stretched across the backyard under string lights that blinked in lazy rhythm. Red checkered cloths fluttered in the breeze, anchored by condiment jars and old horseshoe trophies repurposed as napkin weights. Dolores was the first to arrive, her arms cradling a still-warm casserole dish and her scarf reading "Let the Barbecue Flow" in pink embroidery. Behind her came Lynette with a tub of deviled eggs and Buddy with a pan of lemon bars that never made it more than 5 feet before being sampled. George welcomed each guest with a nod or a quiet "appreciate you," staying close to the smoker, spatula in hand like a baton. The air buzzed with casual laughter and folding chair creaks. Kids zipped between legs, tagged one another under the sycamore tree, and chased a rogue balloon into the garden. Just as George was refilling the sweet tea jug, a familiar voice pierced the chatter. "This is an unpermitted gathering," Karen said into her phone, standing stiffly at the edge of the driveway, clipboard hugged to her chest. She didn't bother lowering her voice. A few neighbors glanced her way, then quickly looked back at their plates, unwilling to dignify the spectacle. Karen tapped her foot and continued, "There's non-neutral music playing and I smell smoke." "Yes, I'll hold." Maggie, George's niece, had arrived minutes earlier in a summer blouse and flats dusty from travel. She was sipping sweet tea and chatting with Dolores about knitting patterns when she noticed Karen pacing. Maggie raised an eyebrow and leaned closer to George. "That woman looks like she's about to call in a tactical team for pork ribs." George didn't reply. He flipped a rib with the calm of someone who had already read the bylaws twice. Maggie pulled a small notebook from her shoulder bag and began scribbling. 10 minutes passed. Karen was still holding the phone, her expression shifting from superiority to controlled irritation. Then, from the street, came the gentle whoop of a siren and the crunch of tires on gravel. A Fairgrove cruiser pulled up slowly and parked with all the urgency of a retired dog. Out stepped Roy, the town sheriff. He adjusted his belt and ambled toward George with a grin. "Smells like Memorial Day," he said, removing his sunglasses. Karen intercepted him mid-yard. "Officer, I called about an unauthorized outdoor event. There are children unsupervised, open flames, amplified music." Roy looked at George, then at the smoker, then back to Karen. "George, you got your permit?" "Filed last Tuesday," George said, passing Roy a paper plate. Roy nodded. "Then I'm gonna need a slice of cornbread as evidence." As he made his way to the food table, Karen stood still, her mouth partly open, fingers twitching on the clipboard. Maggie looked up from her notes and gave her a polite, unreadable smile. Then, with the soft purr of a luxury engine, a black SUV turned into the cul-de-sac and parked just behind the cruiser. The passenger door opened and out stepped Mayor Marielle Foster, in sandals, oversized sunglasses, and a linen dress that caught the breeze like a sail. She looked around, sniffed the air, and smiled. "I smelled ribs from 3 blocks away," she said, walking toward the smoker. "Hope there's cornbread left." A stunned silence gave way to murmurs and a few scattered claps. George handed her a plate without a word, and she loaded it with ribs, beans, and half a lemon bar before settling beside Dolores on a lawn chair. Karen stalked across the yard, clipboard bouncing against her hip. "Mayor Foster," she began, trying for friendly but landing somewhere closer to strangled. This event violates the HOA's updated aesthetic alignment plan. I was not informed of your presence. The mayor looked up, barbecue sauce glinting on her chin. Karen, I'm off the clock. And hungry. And frankly, I think it's time we revisit the code. Gasps weren't audible, but the silence had an edge. Karen blinked, stiffened, and without another word turned sharply and walked away. But not before reaching into her oversized tote and pulling out a folded lavender flyer. She approached the lemonade table, the one Buddy had just replenished, and with theatrical precision, placed the flyer dead center. The wind fluttered the corners as the words stared up in ornate, swirling font. Emergency HOA Behavioral Review, Monday, 9 a.m. By Monday morning, every mailbox on Maple Loop had received a lavender warning. Some neighbors framed them out of spite. The envelopes matched the first, thick, scented, and vaguely smug. Each bore Karen's swirling signature in violet ink and arrived with the precision of a postal ambush. They addressed everything from unapproved lawn decor to aesthetic disharmony in porch composition. George collected his copy, gave it a glance, and placed it beneath the coaster on the kitchen counter like a document awaiting trial. Across town, the post office bulletin board had grown another layer of flyers, some official, some not. One neighbor had posted a bright green sign reading, "Free the Flamingos," beside a notice of HOA meeting minutes. Someone else had tacked up a copy of their own citation, underlined in red and captioned, "Wind chime tone too moody?" At George's kitchen table, Maggie had her laptop open and fingers flying. Her brows were furrowed as she toggled between spreadsheets and PDFs. Her sweet tea sat untouched beside a half-eaten biscuit. "Here's another," she said, scanning an email a neighbor had forwarded. "Non-neutral patio umbrella pattern. That's 3 umbrella warnings just today." George looked up from the Gazette. "She's on a roll." "She's on a crusade," Maggie muttered, typing fast. "And crusades usually end with torches or spreadsheets." Dolores popped in with a loaf of cornbread and a knitted scarf that read "Let the barbecue flow" in looping gold yarn. She placed both on the counter with the same gravity one might reserve for presenting evidence. "Knitting circles fired up," she said, adjusting her glasses. "Nadine's making coasters that say, 'Don't tread on my porch swing.'" "Bless her heart," George said, slicing the cornbread. That afternoon, Maggie and George walked to Buddy's bakery to gather more intel and pastries. The place smelled like cinnamon and accountability. A chalkboard near the counter now read, "Citation cupcakes, 10% off if you've been fined." Buddy slid a manila envelope across the counter without a word. Inside were 3 HOA notices, each for minor violations: off-center pumpkins, disruptive yard scents, and the use of clashing dishware during visible outdoor meals. "Karen wrote me up for serving lemon bars on blue glass," he said flatly. "It's not even a rule, she just said it upset the flow of the hedges." Maggie nodded and tucked the papers into her tote. "You're not alone. I'm building a case." On the way home, George suggested they speak with Ted, the HOA secretary, a quiet man with a fondness for Sudoku and lemon drop candies. He met them outside the clubhouse, looking sheepish. "There are inconsistencies," Ted admitted, voice low. "But I didn't sign off on half those expenditures. Karen says we've had spiritual proxies approve certain things now. I don't even know what that means." "She say that in writing?" George asked. "No," Ted said. "She just says it. Often. While burning sage." George patted his shoulder. "Get some rest. And maybe a lawyer." That evening, back at home, Maggie sat cross-legged on the floor with receipts and emails spread around her like a forensic nest. George made tea and set it beside her without a word. She held up a printout of an invoice from a company called Zenscape Collective. The service billed. Resonance Alignment Consulting. The cost? $4,950. George squinted. $4,000 for resonance? $4,950, Maggie corrected. Just under the $5,000 discretionary cap. She opened the county zoning website and began searching property filings. Minutes passed. Then her breath hitched. "Got something," she said. She zoomed in on a scanned PDF. A zoning variance request filed 2 weeks earlier, signed and notarized. "Notary stamp expired 2 years ago," she said. George looked closer. "That name, Caldwell. Same as Karen's cousin," Maggie finished. She turned slowly, eyes sharp. "Uncle, I think Karen paid her cousin with our HOA fees." The HOA mailbox flap clanged every 5 minutes, lavender warnings now outpaced pizza coupons. By midweek, Fairgrove looked like a pastel crime scene. Every door had its own slip of scented judgment. One neighbor, having received 3 in a single day, laminated them and hung them like war medals beneath their porch light. Another glued hers to a frisbee and sent it sailing across the HOA lawn, a whirling banner of quiet rebellion. George stood in his kitchen war room, staring at the corkboard Maggie had set up against the pantry. It was now covered with pinned notices, printed bylaws, color-coded strings, and sticky notes marked with dates, initials, and a steadily growing list titled "Citations That Aren't Real." "Wind chime tonal aggression," Maggie read aloud, holding up a sheet. She marked it as a Category B vibration violation. "There is no Category B." Dolores entered with a tray of snickerdoodles, each iced with careful, curvy letters that read "Harmony my foot." Around her neck was a new scarf in blazing orange. She handed George one with the word "toneful" stitched in blocky pink. "It's for Buddy," she said. He got dinged for humming while watering his begonias. George nodded solemnly. "He is a rather aggressive hummer." Maggie peeled another citation from the stack. "This one's for non-contemplative yard signage." It was a welcome mat. It said "Welcome." Across the street, Lynette and Buddy were midway through repainting their porches. The colors, tangerine and sunflower, glowed like a sunrise dipped in highlighter fluid. Lynette had added a sign to her railing, "Namaste no." "This," Maggie muttered, typing furiously, "is what happens when lavender goes unchecked." At the community board near the bakery, someone had tacked up a hand-drawn map of new Namaste zones, Karen's latest invention. These were areas where residents were encouraged to maintain vibrational neutrality between 8 p.m. and 10 a.m., including no talking on driveways, no laughing near fences, and, according to one footnote, no barking above 20 decibels. Buddy had responded by handing out dog whistles to every pet owner on his street. Karen, meanwhile, walked the sidewalks like a meter maid with a meditation miner. She paused to inspect gnome arrangements and left pink citations clipped to mailboxes shaped like barns, fish, or in one case, an actual barn cat that refused to move. At George's, Maggie leaned over the dining table strewn with files and said, "None of these violations align with the HOA meeting notes. Most of them were never discussed, let alone approved." Dolores sipped from her lemonade glass. "So she's going rogue." Maggie nodded. "And unrecorded." That afternoon, Lynette stopped by to drop off swatches for the Uplift Hue movement, a spontaneous protest palette made entirely of neon tones. George picked up a lime green square and held it to the light. "Reminds me of my high school gym shorts," he said. "Also, mild retinal damage." Ted arrived just before sunset. He looked pale, like he'd run from his house to George's without fully deciding why. He clutched a manila envelope like it might explode. "I wasn't supposed to keep this, but I did." He passed it to George with both hands and averted his eyes. Inside were 3 memos stamped "Internal Use Only," listing HOA purchases under a category labeled "Restorative Frequencies." One included an invoice for a sound bath session conducted by someone named Sky Waverly. Another mentioned a bulk order of lavender toner and branded meditation pillows. George stared at the papers, then back at Ted. "Did Karen sign off on these?" "She said the board had voted," Ted whispered. "We didn't." Maggie took the envelope and laid it flat on the table, smoothing the corners like it might fold out into a map. Her eyes didn't blink. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm. "She sent a warning to Mayor Foster this morning," she said. Typed, signed, scented. George raised a brow. What did it say? Maggie slid a copy across the table. In curlicute script, it read, "Decorum applies to all, elected or not." "This invoice," Maggie said, pointing, "is for energetic realignment and billed just under the discretionary limit, again." She slid the paper across the table with 2 fingers, like it might catch fire. George adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. The amount was $4,975. The service, once again, was listed as Resonance Consulting from Zenscape Collective. "You could buy a used lawnmower and a pair of goats for that price," he muttered. "And yet we bought 1 hour of ambient chime meditation." They were seated in the corner of the Fairgrove Records office, surrounded by boxes that smelled faintly of toner and something older, like lemon polish and ignored policies. Clerk Brenda, a woman with a fierce gray bun and a sticker that said "Hello, I survive paperwork," had reluctantly let them use the back conference nook. "I'm not supposed to let citizens dig through the 2010 binders," she whispered earlier. "But I'm also not supposed to ignore fraudulent public spending. So let's all be flexible." By noon, Maggie had a full spreadsheet open on her laptop. Duplicate entries, vague service names, strange abbreviations like MFLO and SUL compliance. Some were listed under emergency authorizations, most of which, Ted would later confirm, never existed. "It's padded like a church potluck," George said, flipping through another manila folder. "And I'm not seeing any vote logs." Maggie opened another tab and cross-referenced vendor names with state business registries. When she hit Zenscape Collective, her fingers paused. "Registered to a Charles Caldwell," she read aloud. "Based in Scottsdale, Arizona. Known aliases, Chuck Caldwell, Charlie Caldwell." George's brow furrowed. "Karen's last name is Caldwell." Maggie turned. "Think it's a coincidence?" "Not in a town where people still talk about the firework incident of '92. Back at the house, Ted met them with a worn flash drive wrapped in a lavender ribbon. "She told me to destroy it," he said. "But I think it's time." The files inside revealed fabricated meeting minutes from so-called emergency sessions that had never happened. In one, Karen approved a $3,000 order of chakra-aligned mailbox decals. In another, she listed elevated atmosphere renovations, with no vendor name, just a blurry scan of a handwritten receipt marked cleansed. George read in silence, one paper at a time. He folded each and stacked them carefully. Maggie watched him, noting how still he was. Then she picked up her phone and dialed Mayor Foster. The mayor answered on the second ring. "If this is about another lavender memo, I'm about to unplug my fax machine." "It's worse," Maggie said, calmly. "Much worse." They arranged to meet during the next HOA session. The mayor's voice steadied. "If there's fraud, I'll help shine a light. But bring facts, not incense." That evening, George wandered into the old church basement where Fairgrove kept their civic archives. Among hymnals and out-of-date emergency plans, he found a binder marked HOA Referendum Guidelines, 1998. Dust clouded the air as he flipped pages until one line jumped out. Any HOA expenditure exceeding $1,000 must be presented at a public meeting and approved by no fewer than 3 members of the elected board. He copied it by hand and underlined it twice. Later, at his kitchen table, Maggie examined a zoning approval stamp just days before Karen's crackdown. The notary seal had expired in 2021. The signature was rushed and familiar. "Karen didn't just bend the rules," she said. "She forged them." George exhaled. The sweet scent of warm cornbread from Dolores Drop-Off still lingered in the air. He stood, walked to the fridge, grabbed 2 sodas, and handed one to Maggie. "We're not just making ribs anymore," he said. "We're smoking out a regime." The HOA clubhouse smelled of lavender, printer toner, and suppressed frustration. Rows of metal folding chairs creaked under shifting weight. A long folding table near the front was draped in sheer fabric and sagged at the corners beneath the weight of nervous snacks, lemon squares, deviled eggs, and a bowl of unidentifiable dip. At the back, a raffle sign-up sheet dangled from a clip labeled "Win a quilt, hand-sewn by Dolores, no refunds." Dolores herself sat in the front row, clicking her needles steadily, already 3 rows into a live-stitched chronicle labeled "The Lavender Reckoning." Her yarn trailed like a fuse across the floor. Karen stood at the front, glowing faintly beneath a flickering fluorescent light, her slideshow already projected and titled in cursive, "Restoring Resonant Beauty." She wore lilac from scarf to shoe and smiled with the sort of serenity that made people uneasy. "Good neighbors," she began, voice smooth, "we gather tonight to recenter, recalibrate, and reimagine our shared space." George sat near the middle with Maggie beside him, a manila folder balanced on his knee. Ted lingered behind the snack table, chewing a fingernail and looking like he wished he were a lemon bar. Karen clicked the remote. A new slide faded in, pastel hues, curving arrows, and a concept map titled "Porch Energetics." She continued. "We've come far in cultivating vibrational alignment. Our mailboxes are more mindful. Our wind chimes no longer clash with our curb appeal." George cleared his throat. Karen paused. "If I may," George said, standing. He held up a neatly folded paper. "I'd like to enter this bylaw into tonight's record." Karen blinked slowly. "This is not an open forum." "It's a meeting," George said. "With an agenda, and residents, and a quorum. So by HOA structure, yes, it is." He stepped forward and placed the paper on the table. Section 4.3, page 2. Any HOA expenditure over $1,000 requires recorded vote and public notice. That hasn't happened. But spending has. Maggie rose beside him, plugging her laptop into the projector with a practiced click. The screen shifted from pastel lotuses to a sharp, unblinking spreadsheet. "These are the invoices tied to Karen's discretionary approvals," she said, her voice calm. "Zenscape Collective, Chakrascape Solutions, one payment to a company run by her cousin, Charles Caldwell." Gasps spread like a breeze across the room. "And here," she added, scrolling, "are dates with no recorded meetings. No board votes. No quorum. But lots of checks." Karen's smile froze. Ted stepped forward, voice soft. "She asked me to call them spiritual proxies. Said minutes didn't always need witnesses if the intent was pure." He looked down. "I typed them. But we never met." A silence fell, dense and slightly citrus-scented. From the doorway, Mayor Foster entered and closed her umbrella with theatrical restraint. She looked around the room, took in the dip, the knitted yarns, the spreadsheet, and spoke plainly. "I believe," she said, "it's time we vote. For clarity. For community. And for the future of porch harmony." Hands raised one by one. Even Karen's longtime supporter, the gentleman with the solar-powered birdbath, voted yes. The final tally, 6-0. Karen remained still, clipboard still in hand, scarf unmoving in the airless room. "This isn't defeat," she said, perfectly composed. "It's just a pause, before rebirth." At sunrise, a pink U-Haul blocked the HOA clubhouse driveway. Karen stood beside it wearing a poncho and wielding a wind chime like a scepter. The fabric shimmered in the morning mist, and her boots kicked up dew as she paced in front of the building. Around her, folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle on the green space. At the center stood an inflatable lotus pond, half inflated, with a single floating candle already struggling to stay lit in the breeze. A table draped in lavender tulle held bundles of sage, stacked crystals, and what appeared to be laminated mantras zip-tied to mini bamboo rods. Flyers littered porches and windshields across Fairgrove. In swirly font, they read, "HOA Energy Realignment, mandatory for all aligned souls." Karen tapped her wind chime against a folding chair, letting its hollow notes drift into the otherwise silent field. Ted sat under a crabapple tree nearby, wearing dark glasses and nursing a paper cup of black coffee. His GoPro was hidden inside a bird feeder dangling from the lowest branch. Every now and then, he shifted slightly, making sure it had a good angle. George and Maggie, seated on the gazebo steps just across the lawn, had their own agenda. Between them sat a heavy file box labeled HOA Archive, Irregulars. Inside were copies of invoices, budget anomalies, emails signed Namaste, Karen, and a voice memo in which she referred to zoning laws as suggestions wrapped in bureaucracy. Dolores arrived mid-ceremony, trailing yarn like a comet tail. She held up a freshly finished banner in canary yellow that read, "This yarn is more aligned than you are." She affixed it to the picnic table beside the sage and promptly began knitting another, muttering something about needing more sass in the weft. Karen raised both arms, the wind chimes swinging gently from her grip. "Let today mark the rebirth of our HOA soul," she intoned, eyes closed. "Let chaos be replaced with cadence. Let flow be restored." A glittery yard sign fluttered behind her, its rhinestones catching the early light. "Order begins within," it read in Comic Sans. "Any aligned souls," Karen called, "may now come forward for the cleansing." Nobody moved. An early jogger slowed as he passed, glanced once at the scene, Karen in her poncho, incense spinning from a portable fan, and Dolores unfazed with her banner, then picked up speed. Karen stepped forward to the clubhouse door, keycard in hand. She waved it with ceremonial flair, then tapped it against the scanner. Nothing. She tried again. A red light blinked, then blinked again. She jiggled the door handle. Still nothing. Behind her, the lotus pond let out a long, slow hiss as it deflated further. Across the lawn, Mayor Foster stood with arms folded, sunglasses in place despite the hour. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Karen turned slowly, lips parting, as if to announce her next act, but the silence held. Ted adjusted the camera angle slightly. Maggie's phone buzzed. She looked down, scanned the alert, and tapped George on the knee. "It's from the county," she said. "Unauthorized water feature detected in flood zone." She turned the screen to show the attached photo, a low-res image of Karen's koi pond, freshly dug and positioned precisely where it shouldn't be. George looked at the picture, then back toward the sagging lotus, the sign, the candles fighting for oxygen. "Well," he said, "it was only a matter of time before the fish got involved." By noon, grills were lit, lawn chairs reclaimed their territory, and Karen's Namaste Zone signs had become excellent kindling. The town green shimmered under Memorial Day sun, alive with the smell of charcoal and buttered corn. Magnolia trees offered pockets of shade, their branches dressed in bunting that fluttered with red, white, and defiance. Long buffet tables lined the field, creaking beneath casseroles of every texture and ambition. Someone had set up a lemonade bar beside an improvised dessert station, pies, puddings, banana bread, and Buddy's now iconic lavender-free lemon bars. Children ran wild, their laughter threading through the trees. A few chased one another with strips of shredded HOA flyers turned into streamers. Wind chime fragments clinked on a rope strung between two folding chairs, now serving as a finish line for an impromptu potato sack race. George stood beside the smoker, apron slightly crooked, hair combed for the first time in days. On the chest of his apron, someone had pinned a laminated badge, Defender of Pork and Peace. Maggie had made it, probably after her second plate of ribs. The new HOA board, voted in that morning by a record turnout, stood behind a folding table stacked with reusable grocery bags. Printed on each was the Fairgrove emblem and, beneath it, the full text of the newly restored bylaws. Dolores handed one to every attendee, each folded around a cookie wrapped in wax paper. "Cookies for clarity," she said, smiling. "And compostable, too." Maggie took the mic beneath the main tent, smoothing her skirt and glancing once toward George, who offered a small nod. "Community governance," she began, "must be accountable, even if it wears yoga pants and talks about energy realignment." Laughter rippled gently, respectful but real. "It's not about perfection. It's about participation. And knowing when to say, that's enough. Thank you all for showing up. Not just today, but when it counted." Mayor Foster stood next, applause fading behind her. She smiled down at Maggie and pulled a crisp envelope from her jacket. "Maggie Hayward," she said, "you've been nominated for a statewide Law Fellowship Award, for community advocacy. For building a case out of courage, cupcakes, and one very thorough spreadsheet. Gasps. Claps. Dolores hooped. George wiped his hands on a napkin but said nothing, just beamed like a porch light. Across the field, near the parking lot, Karen's U-Haul sat half-packed. She moved slowly, folding one glitter sign at a time, her motions more careful than resentful. The lotus pond was gone. The tulle tablecloths folded into bins. She paused once to read the flyer pinned to a nearby tree, Barbecue Festival of Freedom, no citations, just sauce. Then she kept packing. As the sun sloped westward, the scent of grilled peaches took over the air. George stood near the pie table when Ted wandered up, holding a charred scrap of lavender stationery between two fingers. "Found this in my bird bath," he said. "Want to roast marshmallows with it?" George looked at the scorched edges and laughed low. "Wouldn't be the worst use of scented paper," he said. They wandered toward the fire pit, flames just catching beneath kindling made from old HOA flyers. Behind them, the town buzzed, casseroles traded, recipes scribbled on napkins, and quilts auctioned for local scholarships. Near the pond's edge, a lone plastic flamingo floated past, bobbing gently, restored and peacefully irrelevant. It turned in the breeze, a quiet sentinel to a town that had remembered its own voice. The sky glowed soft orange as the fire cracked, and marshmallows toasted slowly, deliberately, without a permit in sight. As the last ember of the barbecue festival faded into dusk, Fairgrove felt more like home than it had in years, not because the rules were gone, but because the right ones had stayed. What began as a simple meal turned into a quiet revolution, led by casseroles, knitting needles, and a spreadsheet or two. In a town once bound by lavender mandates and hollow decorum, the people remembered that dignity doesn't come from silence, it comes from standing together. When rules are used for good, communities thrive; when they're misused, they crumble. And perhaps, tucked between lawn chairs and lemon bars, we're reminded, even the smallest porch can hold a mighty voice.